Well, it looks like we're back in business, students. This is Dr. Winkler again. This is Ancient Civilizations, and I believe this is lecture number 11. So we're moving along quite nicely, actually, and we're getting into European civilization. And as I already mentioned, European civilization starts with Greece, and more properly, perhaps I should say, it starts with the Aegean civilizations, which includes the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Now, let me just recap what we were talking about. The Minoan civilization is centered around Crete and some of the islands of the Aegean. I showed you some examples, advanced jewelry. They're awfully good at jewelry making. And of course, frescoes, which are very, very interesting because it gives you a view, a tap, if you will, to understand what life was like and how they like to recreate, how they like to present themselves. The Knossos was the palace complex. Remember, very, very large, not surrounded by walls, so we have to think that largely it was a peaceful area. Linear A was their writing. I showed you examples of linear A last time. It's still unbroken. We still don't know how to read it. Now, some words can be made out. Remember, I gave you a big explanation last time as to the nature of trying to break languages when you have no key. For Egypt, you have the Rosetta Stone for hieroglyphics. There are other stones that inscriptions in multiple languages we have for cuneiform. But you can imagine how challenging it would be to have a writing system for which you have no equivalency that you can read. So you got a problem. Remember, I mentioned that one way you can approach this is by syntax, word structure, that kind of thing, word order, on the basis of various languages. And apparently linear A is not related to any known language or linguistic group because it doesn't seem to have anything similar with them. Well, it's still unbroken. Hopefully, I'm not getting any younger people. Hopefully somebody, young geniuses like yourself, will come up to the plate and be able to figure this out. But it hasn't happened yet. Now, a question, and it's kind of fun speculation more than anything. There is some speculation, there's some question as to why or how the Minoan civilization collapsed. If it's relatively peaceful, it's relatively prosperous, say, well, it could last for a very lengthy period of time, unless perhaps there are external factors. Remember, I talked about the theory of Thera blowing up. You got pumice and you got tidal waves. Some scholars have taken this to a very, very large, shall we say, levels of theory. We do know about when, probably within a century or two, of when the Hebrews left Egypt. And the Bible says they crossed the Red Sea and the sea parted. And the Israelites, the Hebrews, went through essentially on dry land, came out the other side. Remember, in the New Kingdom, we have Egyptians are using chariots. So the king's chariots come after the Israelites, and they go into this area between when the Red Sea was split. And when that happens, then the sea collapses down upon them. Well, do we have any archaeological evidence for this? No, but some scholars have looked at the Hebrew word for Red Sea and see it's like one letter off from Reed Sea. And there is a lake, you want to call it that, on the coast of the Mediterranean. Which is near Egypt. Okay, get it right, Winkler. It's along, how about maps here? It's along the coast of the Mediterranean. If there's any validity to this, that rather than having the Israelites cross the Red Sea, which would be farther down here, they might have crossed across the marshes here, also known as the Reed Sea. And then, of course, the waters parted for them, but there was an inundation of water. They came in and wiped out Pharaoh's armies. Well, let's speculate. Let's say the Israelites, the Hebrews, were actually going up in this direction. They're crossing over here. And this tidal wave that started out because Thera blew up in the Aegean Sea, sometimes taking days to sweep all the way across the Mediterranean and to smash into the coast of Egypt at exactly the same time when Pharaoh's charioteers were chasing down the Hebrews, and this washed them all away. Well, that's pretty fortuitous as far as timing is concerned. I mean, very rarely you're going to have a tidal wave roaring out of the Eastern Mediterranean. That's fun speculation. Is there really anything to support it? Well, really there isn't, other than perhaps a logical argument. Once again, when you look at the height of the tidal wave that smashed into Crete because of the little shells, shellfish, whatever, that are washed up on the land, you can see about how high up it went. The same thing can be true if you, and I don't know any archaeologists have done this, you go down to ancient Egypt and you see if there is any evidence of a tidal wave. Quite frankly, I don't think there is. Fun little speculation. Now, I have something here, perhaps destroyed. The civilization of the Minoans was perhaps destroyed by the Mycenaean Greeks. You see, and once again, these dates can be argued one way or another, but there's an overlap, isn't there? Quite frankly, the height of the Mycenaean civilization, there's an overlap. They're existing at about the same time for several hundred years. We do find on the island of Crete artifacts that are clearly Mycenaean. So we know the Mycenaeans came down there, probably when the Minoans still survived. And so there's contact. Well, of course you'd think there'd be contact. They're not that far away. The Minoans make good money on trading grain, probably other things as well. So why would you doubt that there would be any contact there? Well, there's really no question about this. Another question is, could the Mycenaeans have played a hand or even caused the destruction of the Minoan civilization? Let's look at this a little bit more carefully. I told you last time that I was just about as far as I got last time. I was actually quite shocked. I was literally shocked to read about some more discoveries on Crete. What essentially archaeologists do is they want to go where the artifacts are. I mean, you have no idea of human habitation. It can take a lot of time to dig a hole in the ground, to do an excavation, if you don't have no real inkling that you might find something. So the people live down where they farm. They live down where the crops are. So that's where you look for artifacts. For whatever reason, I guess guys going for a hike, stay in shape. These are, good old, strong, physically able archaeologists. They're up on the top of these hills. They just go up the hills by the, shall I say, above the communities, above the fields. And much to their surprise, they start seeing artifacts. Minoan artifacts on the tops of the hills. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I mean, the fields aren't up there. On top of the hill is kind of rocky. You don't really grow many crops up there. So down in the valley's so low, that's where the crops are. So you're up on the top of the hill, and every morning before breakfast, you probably want your breakfast first, you walk down and you do what you have to with your crops. You tend your crops. You might have a vegetable garden down there, whatever. And then in the evening, or when you're done with your work, you go back up. Day after day. Why would you do this? You see, farmers don't have to worry about staying in shape. These guys aren't doing this for exercise. Farmers are buff. Farmers, because of the nature of their work, you don't have to get them in shape. They're always in shape. Certainly they're not doing it for that reason. What's the real logical explanation? Can we say there's an invasion? Maybe it's very rapid because the Mycenaeans, the Minoans didn't really have time to build walls around Knossos. Could have been a rapid invasion. The Mycenaeans got together, got with their boats, say, let's go down to Crete and take them out. And when they came down, the people, well, unless you want to be killed or enslaved, which are not really good alternatives, maybe you try to survive. You run up in the hills. And you run up in the hills, and the Mycenaeans are going, it's not worth the bother. Better plunder over in the towns. Quit bothering about these people. But these people have to survive. They have to survive by agriculture. Because the Mycenaeans are around, is it possible? Is it likely? Is it probable that we have these people living on tops of the hills in numerous places on Knossos? I said that wrong. On Crete. Simply for protection, because they realize when they're up there, the Mycenaeans are much less likely to bother them, so you can live up there. If this is a good theory, I think it's a good theory. It would be consistent with the argument that perhaps, just perhaps, maybe even probably, the Mycenaean Greeks had something to do with the rapid, what we apparently view as rapid collapse of the Minoan Empire and the Minoan civilization. Well, let's take a look at the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans live in, well, they have colonies. We find the Mycenaeans, kind of Mycenaeans proper, it's down here. They have colonies, outposts, whatever you want to call them, on the fringes. Here's a map of where we believe there were many Mycenaean settlements. Now, when you include Knossos on this, obviously the Mycenaeans did move in here. Did they cause the collapse of the Mycenaeans? I think that's likely. But they actually did occupy the area after the Minoans were no longer in control. That's the nature of the map. This is much like modern Greece, is it not? Mycenae, perhaps the most important city, was right here. Because you have the Minoans and Mycenaeans occupying the same place, this includes Crete. You do find writing forms of both civilizations. Linear A is Minoan, linear B is Mycenaean. It's not the same thing. Well, archaeologists, of course, have been interested in the Mycenaeans for many, many years, going way, way back. And they go down and they try to figure out linear B. Let's take a look at linear B. And, okay. Linear B. A famous quote from an early archaeologist down there doing research. He looks at the linear B and he says, I don't know what it is, but I know it's not Greek. Fortunately for his reputation, it was broken after he died. There was a linguistic genius by the name of Michael Ventris. He worked with Owen Chadwick as well. I don't want to feed you full of a lot of different names, which ends up might be a little bit confusing for you. I think it's easier to give credit to the man who did most of the work. And we usually say Michael Ventris is more responsible than any other person. Now, Mike Ventris, and I try to take credit where credit is due. He's a historian. You can say, therefore, that historians are pretty bright guys. Well, I know a lot of historians are pretty bright guys and pretty bright ladies as well. He knows Greek. Can you say he's a historian, but he's largely a classicist? Because you're not going to spend a lot of time learning Greek unless you're studying documents that are in Greek. Look at his dates. As a young man, he would have been what? In 1942, he would have been 20 years of age. This guy is enormously precocious. As a young man, he knows Greek. And he's one of the code breakers, the work of the code breakers at Bletchley Park, which happens to be in Great Britain. One of the reasons why the Allies won the Second World War, a very important contributing factor to their victories, was the fact that we are reading German codes. This can be very challenging. Yeah, some of the earliest computers that were involved in deciphering codes were used at this time frame. However, the Germans have an enciphering machine called the Enigma machine. It's literally got so many numbers in it that in reality, any possible number configuration can be changed, and there's millions of possibilities. And they change the integer every day. Okay. Very fortunately for the code breakers, one of the first things that were in many, many messages coming from the Germans was Heil Hitler. Well, guess what? If you have Heil Hitler, you have a bunch of letters right there. Now, with the computer, with a similar Enigma machine, this is very helpful. But you still have to have, shall we say, some extremely bright people, linguistic geniuses, that are going to have to figure this out and try to make adequate translations of the codes on a daily basis. The British and later the Americans are extremely good at this. A lot of guesswork is involved. Of course, you have to know German. A lot of guesswork is involved. A lot of understanding thought patterns. But nonetheless, my point is this. Ventris is involved in this, and Ventris has to be a genius to do that. After the war, Ventris sat down and took a look at Linear B, the writing of the Mycenaeans. He takes a look at it, and remember, earlier archaeologists have said, it ain't Greek. He looks at it and says, what if it is Greek? An archaic form of Greek, in other words, old kind of Greek. The kind of Greek we talk about, classical Greek, which is written down many centuries later, is somewhat different, but they're obviously related. So using syntax, which Ventris understands from classical Greek, he's able to set up, and there's guesswork involved here. Can we say there's a little intuition involved? And if you start breaking down a few words here and there, that can lead you to be able to break down some more words as well. So, goodness. In one of the more stunning linguistic feats, probably of all time, without a key, Ventris broke Linear B, and he proved it was Greek. So he's got all these symbols over here, does not have a key. There's no equivalency in any of the language which we can read. And then he figures out how to read this. And of course, he can pull out a text and look at it and say, oh, by the way, I'm reading this, that's what it says. And if you want to be a skeptic, and I'm sure there's a lot of scholars going, yeah, right, sure, You say you think you understand it, but there's no way to be completely sure, is there? Well, let's put it to a test. So Ventris teaches, what was it, 5 scholars, a number of scholars, how to read Linear B from what he has already established. Then they take these men, there might have been women involved too, and they take these scholars and they give them the same text to translate. Now they're going to do this independently. They're not going to talk to each other. They give these people the text, and in doing so, they all translate it the same way. They're reading Linear B. This is absolutely fascinating. It's totally wonderful. Now we know it's Greek. Well, what do we actually know from the texts? Remember when we were talking about, not hieroglyphics, we were talking about cuneiform. It was apparently originally devised for economic purposes, but it's good enough for literature and a lot of other things as well. As we read, I shouldn't say we, I'm not involved, I can't do it, but when scholars read Linear B, what they're finding is economic texts. Remember, you're trading silver and cows and sheep, grain, these kinds of things. Well, that's very, very nice. But we really have not found much at all as far as poetry or literature or history for that matter. But this is quite fascinating that now we can read Linear B. Now, Mike Ventris, unfortunately, see, he doesn't live very long. Let's see, 34 years old. I believe he was killed in an accident. I believe it was an automobile accident, which is quite devastating, literally. Because if Ventris, with his genius, could break Linear B, is it a possibility? He could have broken other languages, give him a few decades or a lifetime to work on something else. Maybe he could have come in. Maybe he could have broken Linear A. That's total supposition on my part, total guesswork. But we'll never know because he didn't survive long enough to try. So the Mycenaeans are Greeks and they can write. Maybe that's the entire point of all this. Well, before I get off to the Mycenaeans entirely, let's talk a little bit about them. Remember, I said they occupied most of the, what you and I would call Greece proper, the Peloponnesian right here, and many of the islands out here as well. They were stunning as far as their workmanship was concerned. This is sometimes called the Mask of Agamemnon. There was a German archaeologist by the name of Schliemann. And very fortunately in one respect, and very unfortunately in another respect, he did a lot of archaeological digs. He did this back in the 19th century, when some of these archaeological sites were largely untouched. He doesn't have the science that you and I have that's available today. 19th century didn't have nearly radiocarbon dating, pottery studies, a lot of things that we can rely on today. He was going for the big kind of artifacts. Rather than being careful in some cases in these excavations to carefully document what he's seeing, he's going straight for the gold, or straight for the, not pottery shards, but complete pottery. Can we say, as important as his contributions are, he probably destroyed a lot of things which we would like to have been able to examine at a later time. In any event, he found a tomb in Mycenae. Was it 1600 BC, something like that? And he thought that he'd found the mask of Agamemnon. Agamemnon, as you know, as you read the Iliad, was one of the great leaders in the Trojan Wars. Well, upon more careful examination, modern scholars have said, no, this is not Agamemnon. It's a different time frame. It's too early to be Agamemnon. Whoever this person was, pretty high important person in Mycenae. You can imagine how much it would cost to make a mask out of gold. Now, unfortunately, it was somewhat bent, but you do get an idea as to the skill and workmanship. Can I pull one up here? You do get an idea that this skill in gold workmanship is really quite advanced. So once again, we're talking about a pretty advanced civilization. Remember, sometimes archaeologists want to say a sophisticated pottery talks about a sophisticated society. Advanced pottery talks about an advanced society. Well, okay. Let's look at some Mycenaean pottery. Does that look a little bit like Minoan? Remember I showed you earlier that had a nice little octopus on it? Okay. Is there a possibility, therefore, culturally there is influence between the Mycenaeans and Minoans? Yeah, probably. Now you've got these guys marching off to war. Get a pretty good idea what their weapons look like, what their armor looked like. We have other examples here. Would we therefore say that we're talking about advanced civilization? Yeah, we probably can say this very easily. Well, what happens to the Mycenaeans? Notice we have right here the Dorian Greeks. Let's look at the Dorian Greeks. How about maps? Well, I'm trying to give you a little bit of a better idea as to their route of migration. Around 1200 BC, remember this is roughly around the year of crises. One of the issues, of course, is iron. Do you have it or do you not have it? Another one is migration of peoples. We talked about the sea peoples that are on the move. We talked about other Semitic speaking peoples that are on the move. And also the Greeks are on the move. I would like to get a little bit of migration here. Maybe I can't get that. Yeah, wait. I mean, that thing's pretty spectacular right there. That's one of the theories as to migrations of peoples. Essentially, what they are is they come down from the land northward. In other words, they might come around from the Black Sea area and move farther south. Why are they doing this? Well, depending on weather patterns, and I'm going to make this argument several times in different contexts throughout this course, is that we do tend to see people moving because of climatic changes. There is a pattern, if you will, in Europe every 15 to 1600 years, which from warm, cold, to warm again. If it's warm, you can live a lot of places farther north. If it's cold, farther north becomes challenging. And about the time frame when it's colder in the weather patterns, shall we say the climatic patterns, we see more migrations. Now I'm going to make a big deal about this when we talk about the Middle Ages, because it's very important for us to understand what's happening now. But can we say this could be a factor in why people every so often get up and move because of weather? The Dorian Greeks come from a northern area. Some apparently come by sea. What I think we're seeing in these maps, I have to look at them more carefully, is that they do come into various areas from the northern areas, and then they do migrate in the Aegean area throughout the sea by the use of the sea. And remember, we end up with Ionian Greeks, which I'll talk more about them in a little while when we get over here. Well, the Dorian Greeks are apparently conquerors. They speak a Greek language. They can probably go down the Mycenaeans and maybe different dialects, but they probably can understand each other, maybe with a little effort, but they can understand each other, we think. They're pushing in, and they actually overwhelm, push out, or absorb the Mycenaean civilization.
That's probably what happened to the Mycenaeans. We have direct evidence of migrations, the Dorian Greeks. Of course, you're going to come in and there's going to be a cute girl who's a Dorian. If you're a Dorian girl, you see a cute guy that's a Mycenaean. I mean, these kind of things. And they probably intermarry, and after a while, you can't really tell the difference. But in reality, the Dorian Greeks are probably the progenitors of the ancient Greeks that create the magnificent Greek civilization. So that's essentially where they come from. I remember when I was a kid, way back, probably grade school, way early, very old memory. Maybe it's junior high school. But they were telling us that there was a Greek civilization. I didn't remember them as being Mycenaean. But then they told us some other peoples came in, also Greeks, and settled in the area. And the people developed into the magnificent Greek civilization. I'm surprised that I'd remember that for so long, such a long time ago. What's even more surprising, I was right. Sometimes you have to be very careful with the kind of facts that you believe, or the kinds of, when you start believing your memory. It's very helpful if you check the facts first. There is a dark age in Greece. Let's get that up here. There is a dark age in Greece. Some classicists, historians, want to call it the heroic age. Dark age and heroic are really not the same thing. You say dark age has a implication of loss of learning and hard times. Heroic age, a little more manly, a little tougher, has a more positive connotation. Really shortly after the Dorian Greeks come in, we see a major decline in civilization in Greece. The magnificent pottery, which I was just showing you a few minutes ago, literally disappears to using much cruder forms of pottery. Once again, if this is an indication of the strength of your civilization, civilization's taken a hit. Not only has it taken a hit, shall we say, in manufacturing objects and in artistry, it's also taken a hit as far as literacy is concerned. The Mycenaean Greeks can read and write, at least an intellectual circle can. But this is lost. Now remember, it's so hard to learn to read and write back then. The number of people that can actually read and write, probably a small percentage of your society. Were the disruptions so severe that there was nobody felt the need who could read to read and write to teach it to somebody else? Is it also possible that a lot of these records being economic in nature, the disruptions in society also had disruptions in the economy? And when you have disruptions in the economy, you end up not needing it. So why spend all the years of learning these kinds of things if you don't need it? The Dark Age Greece has never been fully explained. There are a number of theories. One is, of course, the invasion of the Dorian Greeks. But you would think, even centuries after the Dorian Greeks, that in reality wouldn't have enough time to bounce back. Invasions don't last for centuries. Maybe migrations do. But you would think they'd have time to recover. However, this happens, but not for a very lengthy period of time. Another theory is this, that we have, remember I talked about the climatic theories, hot, cold, that kind of thing, or should I say warm, cold, that kind of thing. There are other theories. What if you actually have a lot of volcanoes around? And volcanoes, as you know, put a lot of ejecta, pumice in the air. And that can be, if you have enough of it, long enough, not only does it get dark, it gets cold. If it's dark and it's cold, then you have a slightly different scenario. Can you grow as many crops? No. Do they ripen as well? No.
fewer crops, fewer people, fewer surplus, fewer works on civilization. One of the reasons why I think this is worth mentioning is that in my lifetime, I remember a little bit about this. Not this. I have to be several thousand years old. Remarkably well preserved, right? No. What year was it? It's in the early 90s, I think. Mount Pinatubo blew its top. Now, do I have to go to Wikipedia? It blew its top. It's a volcano in the Philippines. What year was it? Let's see if I can find that really quickly without wasting too much time. 1991. I thought it was early 90s. The reason why I remember this is I was in the Navy Reserves at that time frame. And I was only in Navy Reserves for about 6.5 years. So it has to be within that framework. Mount Pinatubo blew its stack. And we got all this pumice in the atmosphere. And as you know, even though the Philippines is quite close to the equator, it's still in the northern part of the hemisphere. So the wind patterns tend to be west to east. So you've got, what, 5,000 to 7,000 miles for this to blow across the Pacific Ocean to North America. And they says, well, we got some material in the atmosphere. And you go outside all summer long. One of my favorite summers. Love that summer. I'm a good complainer. I complain all the time. I complain because it's too hot. I complain because it's too cold. I complain it's not one or the other. I just find reasons to complain. In the summertime, I say, my goodness, it's been too hot too long. Why doesn't it cool off? Well, that summer, you could walk outside, I'm not exaggerating, all summer long. And you could even on the ground, the ground looked a little bit orangish, yellowish, because of the sunlight coming through this material in the atmosphere. You look up in the sky and it also looks a little greenish. I should say greenish is wrong. A little orangish, a little yellowish. And rather than having these highs in Utah, as you all know, that tend to go up in the 90s and stay there day after day, week after week, month after month, all summer long it's like 76 degrees. Very comfortable. You walk outside, whoa, this is not bad weather. I'd like another volcano to blow its stack on a regular basis so we can live in a cooler climate. But remember, I'm the complainer. I did have a fear. And the fear was this: that if it's cool in the summer, you still have this material in the atmosphere in the wintertime, whoa, we're going to have a real cold winter and we're going to have a problem. As I remember, that next winter was not that cold. It's more or less what you would expect. But in 1992, we did have a very cold winter that year. In fact, I believe it was the coldest winter we had like in 42 years. Since like 1949 or something. Okay. I didn't make a connection between Mount Pinatubo and that cold winter, which is kind of a year out. And the point I'm trying to make is, from my personal experience, I can remember when volcanic activity has made a difference in weather, has made a difference in the heat of the day. I would think more about this theory, however, as far as ancient Greece is concerned, if the people making the theories had said, oh, by the way, these are the islands or the volcanoes that was doing all this work. And if you have volcanoes that are erupting for hundreds of years, you probably have to talk about where they're at and what they were doing. Nonetheless, it's interesting. Something like that could have happened. Though in the modern world, we are very much in control of a lot of like creature comforts, air conditioning in the summer, heating in the winter. We're in control to a certain extent of the kinds of things that goes on. If we have a drought, we can pump in water, we can get water from the ground, pump it up onto our fields. We have ways of compensating. But we still, to a certain extent, are victimized by the possibility of things happening in the world. What do we know about this Dark Age? There's a theory about the early Middle Ages. We call them the Dark Ages at times. When we discuss the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, I'm going to try to give you a better analysis as to is that appropriate or not, or how appropriate, or what do we mean by that. In the early Middle Ages, writing is not lost. There are things going on, not nearly as spectacularly as we saw during Rome, not nearly as spectacular as we're going to see afterwards. So the question about Dark Ages, when we need to address a little bit more about the early Middle Ages. But the Dark Age Greece, we don't know anything about it. We know something about archaeology. One of the early historians, Thucydides, in his magnificent work on the Peloponnesian War, which we will discuss at a later time, very early in that book, he says, he refers to this time frame. He says, we don't know anything about it. You see, it's not just dark to us. It's dark to them as well. There's really not much going on. Well, what do we know? Remember, I was giving you a description of the topography of Greece. Remember, there are literally hundreds of known city-states. And they tend to live in valleys. They tend to have an acropolis, a high point of the city where you have a fortress. Well, this comes from the Dark Age. From what little archaeology we're understanding, you go back to these structures that were built during the Dark Age, and they're all over the place. We don't see a lot of good pottery. There's no writing at all. Apparently what we're seeing is this, that times are so challenging that you have to spend a lot of time in defense. You have to spend a lot of time behind your city walls or your town walls. Because what happens? Well, if you have a time you don't have enough crops and people need food, one of the ways you can get food is invade your neighbors. This time you do climb the hills, take your weapons, you go over and you grab what you can. But if you want to survive, you better be able to defend yourself from these other people. This is what we think is happening when we actually have a period, literally for centuries, where very little is going on as far as culture is concerned, a lot of warfare, a lot of defense. Now, after a while, if it was in fact caused by a number of volcanoes in various places of the world, if you actually eventually they don't bother you as much. And obviously maybe the weather patterns got warmer anyway. And maybe the Dorian Greeks aren't on the move anymore. Whatever factors were involved, eventually that starts to pare down. So sometimes we start talking about, now we talk about the heroic age. The way I really ought to divide this up is a little bit, what I'm doing here is a little bit confusing. What I do is have the Dark Age and then heroic age at a different time frame. They do overlap, but in reality, they're really not the same thing. Well, expansion and colonies. When issues get better, when things get better. The population, you get more food and the population starts going up. With very few population checks, like, well, they do kill their babies. Sometimes the Spartans will take their babies over to a hill and simply throw them down and kill them. Population control. Other Greek cities tend to do what we call exposure. You take a child out and you leave that child in the hill country or someplace. Now, a small child, without being tended and fed, is going to die. It won't take very long, day or two or whatever. The baby will die. But there are these stories in ancient Greece about the shepherd in the hills, and he hears the baby cry. Oh, he takes pity on the baby. Maybe he needs a baby or wants a baby anyway. So he goes over and saves the baby, and they raise it as their own. Very nice. But there is that possibility that someone might save the baby. So in exposing the baby, take the baby out, that takes a little potential guilt away from you. Well, I exposed the baby, but I didn't really kill the baby. And maybe the baby survived. I don't know that. It's unlikely, but it's possible. Well, so there's something else you can do with you have a large population rather than killing your children. One of the other things you can do is expansion. We have colonies. Let me look at this. In the Mediterranean. I'm going to learn how to do this eventually. I'm going to call for a map. Oh, which one works the best? Remember, Greek proper. The Dorians don't just come in here. The Dorians come here. So we do have the Greeks on the Peloponnesian, I'll say it right, Peloponnesian Peninsula. And we have the Ionian Greeks over here. This is kind of the area of what we kind of call the center of Greece. But look what we have around here. We have Greek colonies. And we have them over in Cyprus. You see, they're all the way around Turkey, what you and I call Turkey, the Aetolian Peninsula. And they're all around, almost entirely around, the Black Sea. Not to be outdone, you see, they crossed down here. The Athenians had too many people, so they sent out colonies. And we believe that most of the people came down here across the Mediterranean and settled over here. So these are related cousins, whatever, across the sea to the Athenians. Going west, notice around the boot of Italy, we have large numbers of Greek colonies. Sicily, very important as well. A few up here on Corsica and Sardinia. A far away is Spain, and over here to southern France. These are not really military conquests. The Greeks don't really get together and say, we're going to invade. These are areas that are unoccupied. Not every place is occupied with culture and civilization at this time frame. Notice we look over here at Carthage. There are no colonies here at Carthage. It's occupied by Carthaginians. The Romans haven't really started expanding yet, but there are Latin peoples that live here. The Etruscans, whom I will talk about later when we get to Rome, are living right here. So we don't see Greek settlements in these areas. These are largely uninhabited areas. Now, this is the choice made by Athens and other city-states to expand. What the Spartans do is they just simply conquer the areas next to them. Well, that's interesting. All right. Wrong place. Go back here. Is that helpful? Well, Sparta's right here. And there's a ridgeline. It's one of these city-states that have hills around it. Now, they have a population problem. The Athenians over here, they go down to Africa. What the Spartans do is they essentially go over the hills. And the print's kind of small. I have a hard time seeing it. But they go over the hills and conquer these areas. And they enserf the people over here. Now, there are rebellions over here that last for decades. These people don't want to be controlled by the Spartans. The Spartans, in their population expansion, have some pretty hard questions, pretty hard situations to solve. They do so by becoming a military state, where you take young boys, usually about the age of 8, and you train them in the military. You put them in what we loosely call a barracks. And if they want to go see their girlfriends, they better sneak out at night. this is actually encouraged, but if you're caught, you can be severely punished or even killed. They're taught to go without food. They're taught to kill at the least provocation. Remember, they can speak the same thing as their state serfs over here. The name of state serf is a helot. And they go over here and they take them, and they can intermingle with these people. And if they ever hear anything that's said by any person that is either detrimental or negative about the Spartans, they pull out a dagger and they kill them on the spot. What we remember about the Spartans is a military society. We do excavations in Sparta, we don't find much of anything. We don't find any really nice pottery. We don't find any great monuments. The Spartans contribute virtually nothing to literature, nothing to art. They're just a militaristic society. They're killers. And perhaps that's the best way we can remember them. So they take one tack, and other states, including Athens, take another approach. And in doing this, we see them, shall we speak, becoming more involved in civilization. Let's go back to our map. You really can't take a society and box it up and put it on a ship, take it hundreds of miles away, voyage can take weeks, months, and hop on a new shore and you just simply recreate the society. Now, everybody's going to come there are going to think that the society I came from is the norm. That's really the way it ought to be. People back there. I believe that way, I think that way. But it's very hard to recreate that. You find temples, Greek temples, on Sicily, for example, and they look like Greek architecture. But you compare them with the kind of temples we see in Athens and other places, and we see there's some differences, there's some changes here. It is basically Greek, but it's not identical. One of the advantages in this kind of settlement is the Mediterranean has what we call the Mediterranean climate. It's not like you're going from Siberia to Hong Kong, where you're going to have significant changes in climate. The climate is basically the same. These people go to various areas. They know when to plant. They know when to harvest. And they know what to expect from the seasons. So there's all kinds of advantages here. One of the more important colonies is over here in the south of France. We call it Marseille. I think the ancient Romans called it Marsilius. It is a Greek colony. Now, before I get on to that, let me take one step back. Later on, a few centuries later, the Romans are going to occupy all of the Mediterranean basin. As I mentioned, there's different people living here. But can we say that basically all of this area is Greek? And Rome, when it takes all this area, becomes the heir to all Greek civilization. So the Romans, who were pretty crude earlier on, become very sophisticated as far as the cultural nature is concerned by their contact with the Greeks. So the fact that the Mediterranean is largely Greek in culture and civilization gives a big impetus for the Romans to be very good at civilization as well, following Greek patterns. It's very important for understanding of Roman and later Western civilization. Let's go back to Marseille. Why would I say that's so important? Well, Marseille is on the mouth of the Rhone River. See the Rhone River here? Oh, what's a good one here? That one, maybe? Okay, Marseille is right here. Notice where the Rhone River goes. It goes over here towards Switzerland. It actually goes within the center of a lot of areas of France. Now, you get up here a little ways, and you can hop over to the Loire, up over here to the Seine. See, Marseille being at the mouth of the river, and the Romans and many other cultures find it very, very easy and valuable to use water transportation. So you have a basic Greek civilization, which is influenced later by the Romans. But this is a conduit by which Roman civilization and Greek civilization, let's put them both together, go up into Central and Western Europe. Because this is a very, very convenient road. It's not technically a road, means of transportation to take ideas and factors in civilizations into Central Europe, France. And later on, when we talking about the Middle Ages, we tend to interpret, medievals tend to interpret medieval civilization on the basis of French civilization. French is seen as being the norm in the Middle Ages, and the other areas like Germany and England tend to be more viewed on the periphery. But you can see how Greek and Roman civilization gets into France and later influences places all over Europe. So expansion colonies, we need to remember this, very important for civilization. Now, normally we think about civilization, great advances in art and literature and poetry and all those kinds of things, taking place in cities. And we see that all the time. I said overstated it. We see that a vast majority of the time, but we do not see it all the time. Because one of the great literary masterpieces in any European language is created during this dark age, heroic age, if you will. This is the works of Homer. We think that Homer lived sometime in the 8th century BC. This is the 700s. This is essentially Dark Age Greece, which is now going over a little bit to more expansion, which we go over to the heroic age. It's a fascinating study to look at what this person did. Now, calling Homer a person, there is a theory that Homer was not a man, but Homer was a woman. I'm aware of the theory. I don't want to disparage it or just dismiss it, but I'm going to say I think Homer was a man. And I'll essentially tell you why. As we read the Iliad and the Odyssey, remember the Iliad is about war. And it's about the siege of Troy. And we have the Agamemnon and the big leaders and Achilles, and they're out fighting and they're crawling up walls with their bare hands to get in and conquer the city. Women don't usually write about things like that. I'm not saying there aren't women who aren't military historians. There are some. But it's much more common to have a man. Well, let's take a look at the Odyssey. Odysseus, after the Trojan Wars, he's sailing. Now, let's see. I need... Okay. Let's try Odysseus, if I can spell it. Yeah, maybe we got that. Okay. As from the description from the Odyssey, we do get an indication of where this voyage took place. And I'm not going to say I agree with every interpretation. This is perhaps one of the better ones. Maybe I need a map of the Trojan Wars too. And yeah, not as helpful as I hoped it would be. Any event, after the Trojan Wars is over, the first book is about the wars. Then we have the Odyssey of Odysseus, and he's trying to get home. And leaving over here, which we believe the Trojans were here. And this is kind of odd because, and I remember he goes to the Lotus Eaters. And the Lotus Eaters, as I recall, are down across the Mediterranean. And I'm not seeing on this map does have a sweep down to North Africa. Now, what they did is they got caught in a storm. Rather than going home, which is over here, he went down this direction. Now, I'll talk more about the story in just a few minutes. But wherever he goes, he's enormously successful with women. Oh my goodness. This guy is such the manly man. The women just fall in his arms all the time. Man, all they want is to get a hold of that magnificent bod. And there's a description there of how good looking he was. Got this long, beautiful, dark hair coming down to his shoulders. Would a woman write this? It sounds to me like a man to me. Of course, we can make the argument that if this was written by a woman, she was appealing to a male audience. That's how she makes her money, is by reciting her poetry to men, and she's going to tell a story that men want to hear. Well, I'm going to opt and say I think the person was probably a man. In any event, there is a tradition that he, if he was a man, was blind. Do we know that he was blind? No. An old story written down much, much later. So can we say whatever we want to know about this person is there's an awful lot of problems in our adequate understanding of precisely who he was, because we don't have many records about him. Now, he's an Ionian Greek. Remember I told you about the Ionians? The Ionians are on the eastern side. None of these are good maps. On the eastern side of the Aegean Sea, they're over here. Remember, the Greeks come in. This is important Greek civilization, but this should not be dismissed as well because there's Greek civilization here as well. Now, you would think perhaps if Homer came from this area, that he would be familiar or potentially more familiar with the Trojan Wars, which took place right up here. Maybe this is the Ionian Greeks are here. Let me see if I can get rid of that one. The Ionian Greeks are here, and the Trojan Wars, we think, took place here. One of the reasons why we think this is correct is that when Schliemann, remember this German archaeologist, in the 19th century, he went to, and he read Homer's Iliad about the war, and he goes over here, and he went where Homer said to go, and he dug where Homer said the city was, and guess what he found? He found a city, which we believe is Troy. Now, there's the Acropolis in this area. It is a kind of a fortress. And when people were examining this, they said, this isn't very big. Well, maybe the stone structure in the center isn't very big, but the city had wooden walls around it, so it's actually a pretty good sized town. Did Homer know what he was talking about? You see, in the 8th century BC, the city of Troy is under rubble. Not going to be excavated for 3,000 years, a long, long time. But he gives a description of the walls of Troy that are consistent with what archaeologists, in other words, Schliemann, found later. They're not exactly perpendicular. They tend in a little bit. So we talked about was Achilles, who got his fingers in the cracks and his sandals in the cracks, able to crawl up the walls. That in reality, that could have been done. Now, there's no way for Homer to know that. Homer's living centuries later. He cannot see this. So there has to be a very strong oral tradition Remember, people cannot read or write at this time frame. There has to be a very long oral tradition. They handed that down to him, which is really quite accurate. Well, how do we know he's 8th century? Particularly in the Iliad, he gives descriptions of armor. And the armor is not the armor of several centuries later. You see, Homer composed this thing. And in composing this, it was handed down verbally for centuries until the Greeks could write again, when it was eventually written down. How can we therefore say that it is actually composed centuries earlier, when in reality it's written down more recently? See, maybe it was composed at the time it was written down. That makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, in looking at internal evidence, Homer gives descriptions of what kind of armor the men are wearing. And in doing that, it is not the armor of 500 BC. It's the armor several centuries earlier. So we have clear evidence that it's probably composed in an earlier time. But remember, I just said people were illiterate. This person, let me say this again, this person composed this without the ability to write it down. This person composed it in his head. Is that really possible? Can that actually be done? Can you actually keep composing and keep on adding to it without losing it? And it's a very, very large poem. I know we have a tendency to say the Iliad and the Odyssey. When they were written, they're actually written at the same time, and it's supposed to be a continuation of the same story. The reason why we separate them is they're both long stories. Now, remember the Codex. I don't have a book handy here. You know it's a book. You open it up and, man, don't have a book? This is embarrassing. Okay, you open a book like that. That's Codex. That's what you and I read as a book. Back then they had what we called scrolls. You would have your writing materials. If you're in Egypt, remember it's papyrus. And you roll it up on a scroll. So you have large scrolls. But you and I can have a pretty large codex. We have a pretty large volume. But after a while, it does become unwieldy. And that's the same thing true with having your books on a scroll. Scroll over here, you have to turn it. After a while, there's just so much material around one scroll, it's very cumbersome to have them there. So as an issue of convenience, if you will, these were divided into 2 books. Now, even though it's the same story, there is a logical break in the story, because after the siege of Troy, then we leave all these other heroes, and the story follows Odysseus in moving around various places, the Mediterranean, and the kind of adventures he has. So these things are absolutely huge. Can you possibly do this from memorization? We have to be skeptical, don't we? I guess you can memorize books. There are stories about people memorizing books. It would take a very, very, very lengthy period of time, and you'd have to really have a real good reason for doing that. And maybe you're just a brainiac and have nothing better to do. But be able to memorize this and pass it down from generation to generation. Is that really done? Can that really be done? We can be very skeptical, can we not? From one illiterate society to person. Well, early in the 20th century, I believe it's like 1920s, 1930s, that it was fascinating. Some archaeologists heard about I should call them anthropologists or historians or classicists, heard about some guy in a guy in Yugoslavia who was illiterate, who made his living by reciting poetry. He would go around to various places, and he would recite something that was taught to him by his father or somebody else, and make some money, people paying for the entertainment factor in the evening. Of course, people are extremely interested in this man. They come down and look at him and find out he's actually doing this. And he's functionally illiterate. He's doing this from memory. As I recall reading about this, there was a couple more men that actually found doing the same kinds of things. But this was over in Turkey. And so it has been done. It can be done. The story is quite brilliant. I know usually when you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, it is somebody in a literature course who's telling you about this, and they make an assignment. Let's read these things. And you know, you're good students. You buck up and say, well, I don't have to like this, but I have to do it. So you end up reading these things. However, the stories are really quite so compelling and quite so well told that there's a following. People actually like to read these things simply by the content. Now, learning ancient Greek to do this is really what you want, what the classicists might want to do. The rest of us are going to read these in translation. But as we look at these things, they are quite brilliant what they are. It's written in a meter. I am so crude on my understanding of poetry. My understanding of poetry is end rhyme. Okay, it's end rhyme, that's poetry, right? Shall we say much more sophisticated poetry is not just end rhyme, it can be end rhyme as well, but it's meter, it's cadence. If it's written in a cadence, and sometimes they accompany this by the use of a drum, you tell the story, and maybe a flute, toot, 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 you tell the story. Can we say that's an aid in memorization? It's going to be easier to memorize something if your brain is ready to keep up the cadence. I can't remember. Iliad is written, maybe it's in see if I can get it. Yeah, worship and war. Okay, there it is. Dactylic hexameter. You people that are English majors, you're into literature, you immediately know what that means. I don't know what it means. But it's a consistent rhyme thing. Literally throughout the entire poem. Now, being able to do that is quite brilliant. Being able to do that and tell a compelling story at exactly the same time is stunningly brilliant. That's really incredible. And as we take a look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, we find that literary elements for this is really very, very brilliant. It's really very strong. I think I'm hurting on time. I don't know why I'm going so slow today. Yeah, I'm running out of time. I'd love to tell you about the Iliad and the Odyssey. Let's wait and do that next time. Whatever I say, I'll just end up, have to repeat myself anyway. So I don't know where you are, and I don't know what you're doing, but I hope it's a wonderful day. I hope it's a good start to your day, and you're going to have a good, happy time. In the meantime, I'm going to enjoy myself, and I look forward to presenting the next lecture. In the meantime, have fun.